The statute of limitations for filing a mesothelioma lawsuit varies by state. Mesothelioma is a rare cancer caused by exposure to asbestos. Asbestos was widely used in construction and insulation materials for much of the 20th century before its dangers were known. People who worked with or around asbestos-containing materials decades ago are at risk for developing mesothelioma today. When asbestos fibers are inhaled, they can become trapped in the lining of the lungs and digestive tract. It can take 20 to 50 years for mesothelioma to develop after initial exposure to asbestos. By the time symptoms appear, the exposed person may have difficulty identifying the specific exposure that caused their cancer. This long latency period between exposure and disease diagnosis poses unique statute of limitations issues for mesothelioma claims. Most states have enacted legislation to address this issue by extending or reviving the statute of limitations for mesothelioma lawsuits. However, the specific rules still vary significantly depending on the state. Here is an overview of mesothelioma statute of limitations by state. Alabama, the standard statute of limitations is 1 year from discovery of injury and no more than 4 years from last exposure. However, some courts have adopted the discovery rule for mesothelioma cases rather than the 4-year limit. Alaska, a mesothelioma lawsuit must be filed within 2 years after the disease was or should have been discovered, but no more than 10 years after the last exposure. Arizona, a plaintiff has 2 years to file a claim from the date of discovery. There is a 12-year statute of repose from the last exposure date. Arkansas, the statute of limitations is 3 years from date of diagnosis or when symptoms should have been discovered through reasonable diligence. California, a lawsuit must commence within 1 year of diagnosis and no later than 70 years from the date of first exposure to asbestos. Colorado, the standard limit is 2 years from discovery but no more than 6 years from last exposure. However, mesothelioma claims have separate rules extending limits to 2 years from discovery or 3 years from death. Connecticut, the limit is 2 years from discovery of injury but within 3 years of the date when the injury is first discovered or reasonably should have been discovered. Delaware, the general limit is 2 years from discovery but within 10 years of last exposure for latent disease claims like mesothelioma. Florida, plaintiffs have 2 years to file from the time the cause of action was or should have been discovered but no later than 4 years from last exposure. Georgia, a mesothelioma claim must commence within 1 year from date of death or disability but no later than 10 years from the date of last exposure. Hawaii, a claim expires 2 years after the plaintiff discovers or should have discovered the injury and the disease's cause, but cannot be more than 6 years after the last exposure. Idaho, the limit is 2 years from discovery of injury and within 10 years from last exposure to asbestos. Illinois, plaintiffs have 2 years from discovery of injury to file but may revive expired claims through other legislative provisions. Indiana, a lawsuit must commence within 2 years of discovering harm caused by exposure, or the date the harm should have been discovered through reasonable diligence. Iowa, the general limit is 2 years from the date injuries are discovered but for mesothelioma claims it cannot expire until 10 years after last exposure. Kansas, a claim must commence within 2 years of discovery of injury or 1 year after a wrongful death but no more than 10 years from last exposure. Kentucky, the period is 1 year from date of diagnosis or discovery but can be up to 5 years after last exposure depending on the court interpretation. Louisiana, plaintiffs have 1 year from date of diagnosis or death to initiate action but limit does not expire until 1 year from death or 10 years from last exposure. Maine, the limit is 6 years after first injury was, or through the exercise of reasonable diligence should have been discovered, but cannot exceed 20 years after last exposure. Maryland, an action must commence within 3 years of the date the injury was discovered or should have been discovered through reasonable care and diligence. Massachusetts, a lawsuit must commence within 3 years from the date a plaintiff discovers or reasonably should have discovered an injury or harm, or 1 year after death. Michigan, the period is 3 years after date of discovery of cause of action. Minnesota, plaintiffs have 6 years from date of diagnosis or 3 years after death to initiate action but claim cannot expire more than 10 years after the date of last exposure. Mississippi, the general limit is 3 years from the date of discovery of the injury but claims relating to exposure to asbestos cannot expire until 6 years after last exposure. Missouri, mesothelioma claims must commence within 5 years of first disease symptoms or within 3 years of death if symptoms did not manifest during lifetime. Montana, the statute of limitations is 3 years after date of discovery but claim must commence within 10 years of last exposure. Nebraska, a claim expires within 4 years after both cause and injury are known or could have been discovered through reasonable diligence. Nevada, a claim expires within 2 years after plaintiff discovers facts that form basis of action and that injury or wrongful death was caused by exposure to asbestos. New Hampshire, the statute of limitations is 3 years from date of discovery but claim must commence within 12 years of last exposure. New Jersey, plaintiffs have 2 years to file from date of discovery. Claim must commence within 2 years of discovery but not beyond 35 years since last exposure. New Mexico, a claim expires within 3 years from date of discovery of an injury and its cause but within 30 years of last exposure. New York, plaintiffs have 3 years from discovery of cause of action. North Carolina, the period is within 3 years of discovery of disease but cannot expire more than 10 years after last exposure. North Dakota, a claim expires within 3 years of discovery of injury and its cause but no more than 10 years after acting personal injury causing exposure. Ohio, plaintiffs have 1 year from diagnosis or death to commence action but within 10 years of last exposure. Oklahoma, the standard limit is 2 years from discovery. Mesothelioma claims cannot expire within 5 years of last exposure. Oregon, a claim expires within 3 years from date of discovery but cannot extend beyond 60 years after first exposure. Pennsylvania, plaintiffs have 2 years to file a claim from date of discovery but within 7 years of last exposure. Rhode Island, a claim expires within 3 years of discovery of injury and no more than 10 years after last exposure. South Carolina, the period is 3 years from discovery but no more than 13 years after first exposure to asbestos. South Dakota, plaintiffs have 3 years from discovery or within 10 years of last exposure, whichever is longer. Tennessee, the standard limit is 1 year from date of discovery but mesothelioma claims cannot expire within 5 years of last exposure. Texas, a claim expires within 2 years from discovery or within 10 years from last exposure, whichever comes first. Utah, the limit is 2 years from discovery but a claim cannot commence more than 4 years after last exposure. Vermont, a claim expires within 3 years of discovery or within 15 years after first exposure to asbestos. Virginia, the period is 2 years from discovery or death but cannot be beyond 5 years of last exposure. Washington, a claim expires within 3 years from discovery but within 10 years of last exposure. West Virginia, the standard limit is 2 years from discovery but mesothelioma claims cannot expire within 5 years of last exposure. Wisconsin, a claim expires within 3 years of discovery or within 10 years of last exposure, whichever is later. Wyoming, plaintiffs have 4 years from discovery of injury to file an action but no more than 14 years after first exposure to asbestos. Statute of limitations laws for mesothelioma reflect the unique latency period of the disease. Most states extend the standard limit beyond 2 to 3 years from discovery and place outer boundaries between 5 to 15 years from last exposure. The specific applicable rules depend on the state where the exposed person resides or where the asbestos exposure occurred. Consulting a personal injury attorney is advised to fully understand mesothelioma claim deadlines in your jurisdiction.